Hi guys, this is Tina. Welcome back to my channel. So I'm just here to bring you a couple of items that I'm putting in my shop, or they will be in my shop, you know, ready for when this video goes up. There's a journal and there's a folio. They're very different style for me. I wanted to use predominantly, you know, some of my vintage supplies to make these things. And I've challenged myself, particularly with this one, to not use bling or anything like that. So it was a bit of a tough challenge for me. But I'm pleased with the results. So I hope that you guys will like it too. So I'll show you the journal first and then I'll show you the folio. The folio, literally, I think I'm right in saying every single thing is vintage in here, except for this net, which it's bound with. But I think everything else is vintage. But obviously when I go through it, I might remember things that aren't. But I'll show you that in a moment. So first of all, the journal itself. So it's bound here with this pretty soft net. This is just some of my old, my daughter's old skirt. So that's how it's bound. It's a ring bound journal. I love doing the ring bound journals. I find them really freeing, you know, in the style of, in terms of what you can do with them. Now on the front cover, so the front and back cover are actually this vintage book, which was where I got the inspiration for this journal. So this whole journal is comprising of images from this vintage book here. So I thought I would use the front and the back cover of the book as the covers for the journal. So I thought it looked really pretty. I really like how it looked, didn't really think it needed much else. So I've just put some lace trim down the side and then some of this vintage kind of doily piece. Now this vintage doily piece, again, it's quite a massive doily and I've cut it up and used it throughout the entire journal. And then it's on the big rings here, so lots of room to be able to turn the pages. And you've just got some lace trim here down the side. And then attached with a bulldog clip on the front, I've got one of those pretty brooch things that we made during the Christmas craft fair ideas. Again, I just thought because it was called Wildflowers, I just couldn't not include it. I thought that the tag just went so brilliantly with this cover. And it's just a little addition, so obviously it's a brooch, but you could pin it on then. You could pin it somewhere in the journal, or you could obviously, you know, take the brooch back off and glue it in or glue it on the cover, however you wanted to use it basically, but I wanted to include that. So that's clipped on the front with the bulldog clip, and then this little puffed heart, hanging heart, which again, obviously I just felt colour-wise, it just looked really nice attached. So they're just attached with the bulldog clip. Let me just try and sit down. I'm up here in the loft today doing this. I normally do flip-throughs downstairs, but it's a really dark day today, so I thought I'd get better lighting up here. So this is a bit unusual for me, and obviously I'm a little bit confined in space, but hopefully it will be okay. So going inside the journal, this is probably my favourite page, I have to say. I just absolutely love it. I mean, to me, I just think, how could you not? Because this is this decoupage napkin, which, oh, is just so lovely, isn't it? I just love that napkin. So, yeah, for me, I just really like that. So, basically what you've got is I've covered the inside of the book cover with vintage book page. And the vintage book page, again, is from this Wildflowers book. I just popped some ruffle down the edge. I've got some coffee dyed doily, one of Rachel's labels there backed onto some soft net, a piece of vintage, that vintage doily there, and then just flower picking, just a couple of little words from the vintage flower book, which I've obviously inked up and popped in there. And then I just popped in, I've got the contents page with the list of illustrations. I love pages like this. I just love the format of the text and the fonts. I just think they always look really pretty. So I've included that. And then I just included one or two of the illustrations which I didn't actually get round to using in the journal. So, I mean, obviously this was quite a thin book and I pretty much used everything from the book. These were just the leftover pages. So I thought I would include them, and then you can either kind of gesso over them and, you know, write on them, or you could paint on them, or you could obviously tear them out and kind of, you know, stick them around in the journal or make your own ephemera. But I thought that I would just include them for you to use as you wish. So that's that page. Then going on, so this page here is contains this fold out, flip out. Now don't forget, this journal is on rings, so anywhere where you think, oh, that would be tricky to write, say on this surface, you can obviously undo the rings and take pages out individually to then, you know, fill them in and things. So you've got quite a lot of journaling space on here. It's all coffee dyed card. Another one of Rachel's labels, some lace trim down the side, a bit of doily, and then here you've got some of the vintage images, some vintage sheet music, a couple of vintage postage stamps, and then some more of that gorgeous decoupage napkin. So that's that piece. You've got here some more of that vintage doily, and then just another little touch of that little bit of decoupage napkin there, onto some sheet music here, and some vintage book page. And then I just made a little tag here, again, just kind of coordinating because it's the same napkin obviously, and just inked it up around the back. Another one of Rachel's labels and the word flowers. So that just tucks in there. I just think that whole page just looks, oh, lovely. I love those colours. So going over the page, you've got, this was one of the items that we made in the mass making workshops, and it's a coin envelope, and tucked in there, we made this again, I think during the video, I just made a little sort of coordinating journaling card. So that goes in like that. You've got some lace trim and the pearl trim there. I think I'm right in saying that's the only bit of blingy type trim that I've got in this, because I'd set myself a challenge really to create something, you know, with no bling really. So yeah, that was challenging for me, but I do like how it turned out. So on here, you've got some more of the decoupage napkin, you've got some stamped items, vintage doily here, and then this black and white image from the Wildflowers book, which I just love how that's poking out behind some more of the vintage doily and some paper ruffle. This is a vintage bit of, I think it's like a kind of lesson plan. So it was actually, this is how it was like upside down, if you see what I mean, but you've got there this little kind of score point chart thing on the back. So again, I just popped that in. I popped a little butterfly on there and inked it all up, and you can just obviously, you know, journal on that. So that goes in there. Then on this facing page, again, you've got some more of that vintage doily just hanging off the page. I love how that looks. And then I just did a little kind of matchbox book. Now, again, this is from a different book of flowers, again, a vintage book. So I left all the kind of vintage yumminess of the page itself, and just the picture that was mounted on this page was like hanging off, and not the nicest picture. So I took the picture off and I've made a little kind of matchbox book instead from it that just tucks in like that. And then I just layered up some vintage sheet music, another one of the images from the Wildflowers book. It's also a pocket, so I just tucked in one of Rachel's labels into the side, some decoupage napkin up there, and some sheet music here. And then this here is just a little stamped image of a postcard, and again some more decoupage napkin on there. And then going over the page here, we've got vintage book page, we've got some doily, again some more vintage images from the Wildflowers book, and I've just kind of scattered them around. And then you've got just a little flip down here, so more journaling space. You've got a little label here, and then it's also a pocket, so you've got some ruffle here, and then popped up in the pocket another one of those stamped postcards. So again, you can journal on the back of that, and that just goes in there. Then here, these are these gorgeous images. Let me just stand up and check that it's in frame, because I don't normally film here. It's kind of hard to say, but aren't they just beautiful? So I wanted to leave these in their entirety. They were kind of hanging off, which now I've got this horrible feeling I forgot to maybe glue one or two of them down, but oh, perhaps not. Yes, I knew that I had forgotten to stick one down. So that one I will obviously glue that down onto that page. But I just included those as they were because I thought they were gorgeous, and obviously they're vintage, they're from that vintage book. And I left on all of this because I think this is really rather nice where it's been sort of removed from the book. But you've got all this for journaling space. Then on here, I just collaged up a variety of bits, another vintage image there, another one of Rachel's labels, and some more of that vintage doily. And again, you've got journaling space on the back. Here, this image again from the vintage flower book. I will just stick that in. But you've got there more journaling space. Then you've got this one actually I have stuck back in, so didn't forget that one, but journaling space on the back of there. Then here, this is an envelope, so again I just kind of decorated up the envelope, collaged up some lace and some doily, a bit of stamped image here, and then a butterfly here, and then I just layered this with, again, some vintage magazine page. And then on the back I've just popped another one of those gorgeous images from the Wildflowers book, and then obviously those words, wildflowers, bit of doily, and you know, coffee dyed paper doily, and some more of that lovely vintage fabric doily on there. I love how that looks, just looks really nice. And that's all been coffee dyed as well. And then tucked into the envelope, this is another picture from a vintage book, which all I've done is coffee dyed it and mounted it onto some ivory coloured card. So it's a really big tag. I love this image. I mean, I think that might even be like a hearse or something, or perhaps it's an ambulance, because it's a nurse here, so it might be an ambulance. But it's a lovely picture. And obviously it gives you a lot of journaling space on the back because it is huge. Then you've got a little fold out book, and again you could obviously pop extra pages in here or anything if you wanted, or you could pop a flippy pad in there or something if you wanted extra pages. I just wanted to keep it quite simple, but of course you could have extra pages if you wanted. So going over, and then what I've done, I've included some coffee dyed sheets here, all just for journaling, so they're all plain, you know, so you've got plenty of, you know, fuss-free zones to be able to journal on. And then we're back to the decorative parts again here. So basically you've got some of that vintage doily here, vintage book page, some coffee dyed paper doily, and then tucked in the side, this is just a little envelope. I have made a closure with this stamped butterfly, one of Rachel's labels on the front, and then tucked in here I just included a bunch of vintage stamps, you know, which are genuinely vintage items. So I thought that was really nice. That just tucks back in, and all of it just tucks in there. And then I did this little page, which I think I maybe did this as a closure, but now it's always hard to remember, you know, once you kind of have moved on from doing that. So that closes down there with this stamped image, but other than the stamped image, this is all kind of vintage stuff. And then going inside, I just included a fly sheet from a book which had a little bit of scrawl on there, you know, from where there was a little note when it was gifted to somebody, and that was for Christmas in 1944. So I thought that was really nice to just include as a couple of extra journaling pages. To be honest, it holds clothes pretty nicely anyway. You don't really need to tuck it in, but obviously if you do want to, then, you know, that will tuck in like that. Then going over the page here, I made a little pocket here again with some of the pages from the Wildflowers book. And then I just did a little flippy outy kind of piece here for more journaling. And again, don't forget, you know, it's a ring bound journal. So again, you can remove this from the page, you know, from the book to be able to journal. You've got some fabric ruffle here, and then some vintage doily here. And then tucked in there, I've got some of that lovely vintage wallpaper, which I have been using this for my new beginner's kit, which I'm still working on the series, would you believe? It's taking quite a long time because I've been kind of waylaid with some other stuff that I've got going on. And I've then popped this image from a vintage book on here as well. And then this was some fly sheet from a book. I mean, you can probably see it's pretty marked where it's obviously kind of a vintage book there. But I just made a little folding flip, and I just popped that in like that. So that just tucks in here. And then also tucked in there, this is a vintage envelope, and it's a vintage window envelope. Isn't that lovely? I just really like the style of the windows. They're really kind of skinny compared to window envelopes nowadays. So all I did was, obviously I tore out a picture from the Wildflowers book, and I mounted that behind the window envelope. So that's all that is, but I love how that looks. I just think it looks gorgeous. So then place some doily on there, and also some of the vintage fabric doily. And then tucked inside there, again, I just used another one of the fly sheets, and just mounted some of the vintage sheet music and some more of that vintage image. And that's it. I just tucked all of that in. So you've got, you know, obviously plenty of room for journaling on the back of there. And it all tucks into that vintage envelope. So it just all feels lovely because it's all very, you know, fragile and flimsy, like the paper kind of was back, you know, back in the day. So then on this page, I've just got a little fold out flip. So I've held it closed with a paper clip, and I've also clipped on a couple of extra items. So this again is another one of those kind of grey pages which we had here. Again, it was another one where the picture wasn't all that lovely on there. So I just removed the picture. They were hanging off anyway. Left all this again because I just love the look of that. So you've got journaling space in here, which again, you could add some more pages as a flippy pad or whatever. Layered up some of the wildflower images on the front and a little, you know, the flower name on there. A butterfly here and some sheet music there. And obviously held onto there, I just have attached a couple of, these are copies of some vintage photographs onto craft coloured card. And then this one, again, this is an original, you know, image from a vintage book, which again, it's been coffee dyed and just popped onto this card there. So they all just paper clip on, and then tucked in the side, it's also a little pocket, and I've just popped a stamped postcard image there, which I've just backed onto some coffee dyed paper. So again, quite a few kind of journaling cards and bits for journaling in there. And did I say vintage doily here and a fabric ruffle down the side? Now I can't clip this back on. Okay. And then going over the page, we've got here a little envelope that I've made here from some vintage sheet music. Again, I layered up an image from the Wild Book of Flowers onto some soft nets. And then I tucked in here, which now I'm not going to be able to get it out. Oh, tucked in here. There we go. Oh no, what I did to the butterfly. Tucked in there, I've just got again some coffee dyed paper that I've just cut into a long skinny kind of opening fold out. Bit of the wildflowers image there from the Wildflowers book, and a butterfly, which obviously, as you can see, I damaged pulling that out. It's not ripped or anything, but you know, just beware of that. So that just tucks into this envelope like this, and obviously it's quite a snug fit, so be careful. And then you can just fold the flap over there, and then tucked in the side. Oh, love this page, by the way. When this, you know, is no longer in the pocket, I just love how that looks. It's got some more of the vintage image from the Wildflowers book just behind it, layered up with some doily. You've got the doily from the page before, sort of, you know, visible. And then this envelope, I just love how that looks. It really looks nice. And then here I've just included a little pocket which I've made with a flip up or flip down on there. Again, another one of Rachel's labels, and then popped some decoupage napkin on and a stamped image there as a journaling card. That all just pops in there. And again, I mean, obviously the back, you've got the flap from the fold out, but I've included it so that you could either use this in here somewhere, you could glue it in, you know, maybe on one of these pages you could pop it on, or you could put it into a different journal, or you could obviously just pop some plain coffee dyed paper on the back and use that as a journaling space in itself. So I just left it for, you know, whoever owns this journal to kind of decide what to do. And then on this page I have created a book page pocket, which I haven't done a tutorial yet, but I'm going to be doing a tutorial of how to do these. Again, I think they're a new idea, but it may just be that I have not seen these anywhere. So please do not, you know, think that I'm, you know, claiming this as my own, because I am claiming it as my own at the moment because I haven't seen it anywhere. But I know Patricia obviously is the queen of book page pockets, and she might have already done this pocket, but I might have just not seen it. So anyway, so it's a vintage book page, and then you've got an image from that vintage Wildflowers book, the word lovely. And then here, this is just a vintage invoice. Now, I can't actually even tell whether this is the original or a copy. I think it must be a copy. I have copied these, so obviously now I'm unsure whether this is the copy or the original. I think it's a copy, but anyway, it feels very nice and vintage, and certainly it looks kind of vintage. So I just folded that down nice and skinny so that it tucks into here. So, and again, I'll just kind of show you how these two pages look when they're kind of just next to each other without all the bits in. I just think they look lovely, don't they? So I almost don't want to tuck the bits and pieces in, to be honest, but anyway, that's what they're there for, isn't it? So I will tuck stuff in. So this one again is quite skinny, so you know, not very careful old me. I'll tuck that in, but probably whoever buys this will be far more careful. Then I just included one of those gorgeous images from the Wildflowers, actually not from the Wildflowers book, from a different vintage book. So that just tucks in the back pocket like that. And then I just made a little folding little piece from some vintage book page, stuck on a couple of bits from the fly sheets there for journaling, and layered up a couple of you know, vintage wallpaper here and this vintage image from the book there. So that just tucks in here. And then you've obviously got some fabric ruffle going down the bottom. And then going on to the final page, so I'm just going to check I'm in frame and filming. I haven't checked that for a while, so a bit nervous now. So on here, basically what I did, I've done a, what do you call these? Like a policy envelope winder mechanism for this little fold out piece here. So again, you've got obviously journaling space here, and again, you know, don't forget ring bound down album, so you can obviously take the bits out or the pages out. So you've got room here for journaling. Again, you can pop some extra pages in if you wanted, or a little flippy pad. Layered up obviously some of the image from the vintage Wildflowers book, and this actual booklet is made out of like the back cover of some sheet music. So this is all vintage, you know, this is a vintage fold out, this is a vintage image, vintage sheet music, everything's vintage except for the net and this piece of lace, but this doily is vintage. So again, that string just then winds round there, and then just tucked in you've also got a pocket behind, and I just tucked in a little journaling card into there. So again, obviously when this is not wound round, you can tuck it in, you know, you've got more room to tuck it in. Okay, so going on to the inside of the back cover, again, what I've done, I just popped on one of my pockets that I did a tutorial for. This is made from some book page rather than A4 paper. So I've lined the inside of the, you know, this hardback cover with some of the vintage flower book page with this gorgeous image, one of Rachel's labels onto some net, vintage fabric ruffle, sorry, the vintage book page making this pocket. So you've got some doily on here and you've got some lace trim. Just did a little tag there with one of Rachel's labels, and it's obviously just plain on the back for journaling. That just goes in the back there, and then I just included a journaling card there, and then one of those vintage photographs printed out onto the craft card. And then here, this is just a little pocket that you can obviously move this around in your journal, and it's got a couple of Rachel's labels tucked in there. So that just literally tucks in here, and you've just got on this pocket some stamped image and a bit of that, I think it's called broderie anglaise, and that just is there. So that just tucks in there. So that's the entire journal. I mean, it's quite fat, as you can see, but not unmanageably so, I think. And then obviously, as I say, these couple of bits here, they're just little extras really that I just thought complemented the journal really nicely and went really well with the colour. So they are just hooked on with the bulldog clip there. Oops, haven't made a very good job of clipping that one on. There we go. And then obviously, as I say, it just ties closed with the length of soft net fabric here. So that's the journal. You know, really different style for me in many ways. It was kind of lacking the bling and all of that type of stuff, but I like how it turned out. This one here, again, very different for me, and I hope that you're really going to like it. So if I go through this, so this is not vintage. This is some soft net again from one of my daughter's old skirts. So I'll just move that to the side. I think I'm right in saying pretty much everything else in here is vintage, but I will point out anything that's not. So the actual outside of the folio, it was all made from, trying to remember what it was actually made from. It must have been made from envelope, I think. I only made this week. What is wrong with me? I actually can't remember. It might have been vintage file folder actually. And then what I've done on the front cover, well, on the back cover, I've just put some vintage sheet music. All of this lace, this coloured lace here, this is all vintage. So it's all, you know, this is vintage, the book page is vintage, everything's vintage. This is an image from a vintage book. What a beautiful image. Now, the only other thing that's not vintage are these flowers, which have kind of popped in behind, or popped in all throughout the project. These are the flowers that Laura gifted me that she had painted gold, and really oddly, don't they look lovely upside down, where you've got touches of gold with the original colour of the flower? Clearly they were not intended for that way round, but they look lovely, don't they? So I've used those throughout. There were some that were kind of pale blue on the underside with just the touches of gold coming around, and they just went perfectly with this. So they're throughout, and I will show you those as we go through. So on the front cover, I have obviously made this pocket here with this vintage book page, and then you've got obviously the vintage lace there. This is a vintage envelope, you know, proper vintage old envelope. It was actually falling apart, so I had to actually you know, re-glue it down because it was all literally hanging apart. So it's pretty fragile. I mean, I must say that everything in here is pretty fragile because obviously it is, you know, old vintage stuff. So then on there I've layered up some coffee dyed doily, not vintage, vintage lace, image from the vintage book, one of those pretty blue flowers that I was saying about from Laura with that are painted gold on the other side. I just love how they looked on, you know, on the underside. And then a bit of bling. So this one has got bling, even though the other one didn't have. And then tucked into that vintage envelope, I've just incorporated some coffee dye paper here with some vintage sheet music, vintage image, the vintage lace across the top. And then here I just made a little flippy pad with just, you know, a few coffee dyed pages basically on there, and then I just topped it off with some vintage book page there over the top. So quite a bit of journaling in that little pad, and that all goes back into this vintage envelope delicately or gently. And then opening up the folio. Now again, very, very different for me. I mean, normally I'm, as you know, a bit of a more is more, you know, decoration everywhere. But I really restrained myself. I wanted to kind of test myself and see whether I could do this. And actually, I must give credit to Rachel Tomlinson is her name. She does lovely work and really lovely videos. And she did a vintage folio. She was my original inspiration. When I saw hers, I thought, oh, I'm going to do that. Mine is very, very different to hers. I mean, actually, to the point where if you watched it, you'd think, what? She was your inspiration. Where did you go wrong? Because it's not resembling hers. But that was where I originally kind of came up with the inspiration of the colourless and the vintage items, really. I don't think she incorporated lace in hers, but I can't remember. I'll try and remember to link her video below because it was really beautiful, her folio. Yeah, really, really nice. So she was where my original inspiration was, and I wanted to see whether I could do something a bit plainer and a bit more colourless. So here you've got vintage sheet music, you've got more of that vintage lace, you've got some bling here and one of those, again, the kind of blue flowers with the gold from the ones Laura gifted me. Here, this is actually some Eton, you know, the college, the Eton College, what do you call those? You know, like their magazine. I think it was from 1909, but I have got the actual cover, so I'll check the date when we get to it. But that I managed to get. And I just thought, wow, that's awesome. So that's a little section from that. This is a little vintage photo. I mean, as you can see, it's got marks and things on it. That's how it was when I got it. It obviously is vintage. It's from 1925. I can't read exactly what that says, but it was obviously the priest who married somebody in 1925. And I thought I would tuck that in there. I actually thought it could do with coffee dyeing. But I didn't want to risk it, so it maybe could be inked up though. Then this is again another one of those gorgeous vintage envelopes, which I just love, these small pockets, small windows. They're gorgeous, aren't they? Another one of those flowers. I'm sure you probably agree that they just look awesome, don't they, with the touches of gold on them. Really pretty. Obviously inked up the whole of the envelope, and then this envelope, I left the window, as a window rather than covering it like I did in the journal. And then I just made a little folding sort of flip out, again with just some coffee dyed pages. Oops. Oh, I was trying to think why that wouldn't turn. Yes, because it's a flippy pad. It's not stapled in at the thing. So that's why that's not turning there. So obviously you've got this like a seam, if you see what I mean. So you'd fold it back. Oh, and I've done that upside down. Sorry about that. I've actually put that in upside down for some reason. Anyway, so you've got some more pages there for journaling. And obviously when you then tuck that into that vintage envelope, which, again, this all feels just lovely. It's proper vintage, nice, lovely, fragile feeling stuff. And again, that vintage image is then visible through the window, which looks lovely. So that just tucks in there. Then here you've got a little folding kind of pocket. Now, ordinarily, again, I would kind of pop a pocket on here or an image. But you know what? I actually just really loved the look of this. I just thought was absolutely gorgeous. And I didn't really want to cover it up. I played around with different things, images, pockets. And actually, I thought some things are really lovely in their own natural state. So I left it like that. You've got some vintage lace down there. And then on the back of there, again, just some more of that vintage sheet music, some more of the vintage lace. And this time I did pop on a vintage image, but I just think it looks just right there. Tucked into the pocket, you've got quite a few items. So this is just a page from the vintage book, which again, sort of time-wise, I think the kind of period of this picture goes really nicely. Then here I've done a little fold-out kind of booklet, I suppose is what you'd call it. Again, it's got vintage images, it's vintage book page, it's vintage sheet music, vintage lace. You've got, not vintage coffee dyed doily there, the not vintage flower from Laura with some bling. A vintage playing card, which just I popped in there. Love the patterns of these. Then you've got a pocket in here where I've just popped in some of those gorgeous vintage cigarette cards. So I love how they look. And I've just popped those in there. I've popped in some extra book page for journaling, just in there. So you've got some sheets for journaling. And then this here, this is an actual vintage photograph. So again, you've got journaling space on the back of that. So that tucks in there. And then on the back, I just covered it with some jotter kind of paper from a diary, not vintage, but coffee dyed. So you've got more room for journaling on the back. And obviously the whole thing is, got the vintage lace down there. Then here, this is one of those glassine packets or pockets or envelopes or bags. I don't know what you'd call this really, but it's got a fold and it's got some, self-adhesive strip. But I've left it obviously open. And again, I've just popped some coffee dyed doily down. This is coffee dyed, obviously, and ironed. Another one of those flowers from Laura, which hopefully you can kind of see there. It just looks so awesome. I'm going to do that with loads of flowers, I think. And then you've got here some vintage. It's from a little tiny vintage diary. So I just popped that in. So it looks like it's addressed to somebody. And then I just included some pages from this vintage diary from 1948. and I just stapled them together through the middle, so they're like a little booklet, but that again is, you know, vintage from 1948. So lovely kind of keepsakes and things like that that you've got in here. So all of that just tucks in to this pocket, which now I'm not going to be able to get the right angle because it's kind of wedged at the back of the desk. Well, not the back of the desk, but onto the chair that I use as my tripod. Oh, come on. Okay, right, so that's all in there. And then on here you've got a fold up flip. So this again, more room for journaling. This is not vintage, this is just some coffee dyed card, some doily and another one of those blue flowers. Underneath there you've got here some vintage book page with some vintage lace, another one of those flowers, and this is a pocket where I've just included a little coffee dyed envelope with again some vintage notes, vintage postage stamp, one of those flowers, vintage coffee dyed doily, and then again I just popped in some of the vintage postage stamps. So just a handful of vintage postage stamps there, all just tucked into here. So that just all goes in there, and then when this folds down, what you've got is an envelope that just is literally tucked into there. It's not stuck down. Again, this is a vintage envelope. It's one of those window ones. So I just covered the whole envelope with various things. They're all vintage things, except for the flower and the bling. And then inside there, I just popped in some of these little, I think they're like bingo scorecards. And again, they are vintage. So they're popped in there. And a little bit more of that little diary page from 1948. You've got some more pages from there. So, you know, really lovely actual vintage memorabilia and kind of things here. And that just all tucks into that flap like that and hangs over. Then tucked in here, so again, this is just vintage sheet music, vintage lace and some bling. I just made this really skinny, long journal. And again, you know, this is just coffee dyed pages inside. It's not sort of decorated up or anything like that. And just on the front, you've got here some vintage sheet music, a vintage advert here, and some coffee dyed doily, and then that vintage lace, some bling, and another one of those flowers. I know I keep poking those up to the camera, but I just can't tell you how much I love the the underside of them. I mean, I liked the gold side, but when I turned them over and just held them against, because obviously I was going to stick them on gold, and then when I turned them over, I thought, oh, that's even nicer. Then folding over, I've got a little fold out flip here, which again, it's just got some vintage lace. Hopefully I'm in frame for this. So you've got journaling space here, some coffee dyed doily and another flower. Journaling space here, and then here you've got some more journaling space. No, that doesn't open. Then it opens here, and you've got then some more journaling space, and this time it does kind of fold out like that. So plenty of room for journaling. And then here you've got, again, some vintage book page, and then tucked in to this vintage book page pocket, which again, you've got a fold down flip. So that just literally folds down. And that was just finished with some coffee dyed doily and another one of those flowers. Behind there, you've got sort of a secret journaling space, vintage lace, some bling, vintage lace down here. And then tucked into that pocket, you've got another one of those vintage envelopes. I just love those. I don't know how many I've got left, but I'll probably end up not having many left soon. So I'll probably start hoarding them and stop using them. But and I've layered up some vintage book page, sheet music, a vintage image, some vintage lace and another one of those flowers, a bit of bling. And then tucked in there, I've just popped some vintage paperwork here in this invoice from 1946. And also a vintage photograph. So again, it's genuine vintage photograph, and that's just tucked into the envelope. And I just held that in there kind of in the envelope because then it tucks in, you know, quite nicely into the pocket. Then on this side here, you've got a little fold out flip. So this, again, I made this pocket from some vintage magazine, doubled up the page and made a pocket here. Vintage lace and some bling, and then I just made a little flip out. So again, some vintage book page, some vintage lace, in the pocket, another one of those cigarette cards, vintage cigarette card, that just goes in there. And then on the front, some vintage sheet music and a vintage image, the vintage lace here. This is not vintage, this piece of lace, but I just layered it on there. And then tucked in the top of there in the pocket is another vintage photograph. Again, this is a genuine vintage photograph. It doesn't have a date on it, but anyway, it's pretty old. And yeah, genuine, so you can, you know, journal on the back of that and things. So again, tuck that into that pocket and then fold that over. And then in the back of here, so this is obviously the back of the folio now, but in this, it's a pretty roomy pocket. You've just got some vintage sheet music, lace, and the doily. And tucked into there, I've just popped a whole range of stuff. So you've got here, this is a girl's own image. These are some vintage images from, I think it was 1910, or it might have been 1890. I can't actually remember, I'm afraid, but it's genuinely vintage. It's, you know, really, really lovely images. I'm trying to see whether there's a date anywhere on here. No, I can't see one, I'm afraid, but anyway, it's genuine vintage and just gorgeous, so I thought I would enclose that. Then here, this is a piece from the, I think from the Eton catalogue, I actually can't remember now, but again, vintage paperwork, so that's really nice. Here you've got a vintage invoice. It's got sort of marks on it. Again, it's got like a big grease kind of mark here and things. This is how it was when it came to me. Obviously, it's, you know, it's vintage. It's from 1946, so it's not going to be perfect, or, you know, unlikely to be. But again, you can journal on the back, and it's just lovely to have your hands on some kind of nice, genuine vintage stuff. And then here you've got a concert pamphlet from 1952, and this is from a night at the opera. Trying to see where it was. Oh, the Assembly Hall in Walthamstow. Yeah, 1952. So it's just the programme from that. So I thought, again, that was really, really nice. And again, I mean, you could probably ink that up and it would actually kind of look even better, you know, tucked in here. So you've got quite a bit of vintage paperwork. And then here I just made a tiny little journal. So I made the journal from the cover of the Eton College Chronicle. That was the word I was looking for. The Eton College Chronicle. And yes, it was from 1909. And the date on this, I think, was January the 5th or something, 1909. Absolutely awesome. So I just literally kind of folded it over and glued it together to make the cover. Popped on some vintage lace, another one of those little flowers. Again, looked at layering things to cover, you know, pop on the cover, but I didn't want to cover up the lovely scroll and the crest and things, so I just decided to leave it as was, really. I did ink it up, and then on the inside, this is again from some vintage magazines, so I made a pocket there, popped in a vintage little bird card, like a bird watcher's card. And then here, this is just some coffee dyed paper bag with a bit of coffee dyed doily on. And again, this is just like a portion of an airmail envelope. So I just took the airmail envelope and just popped on a vintage stamp there. So a bit more room for journaling there. That just tucks in there. And then here I just did some, this is some genuine vintage document, which again I just coffee dyed. Then you've got some coffee dyed pages, just, you know, various different papers, all in there. Some more of that vintage document, which I coffee dyed. So, I mean, although it's quite a small journal, obviously it's undecorated, so every page is writable. So although it's quite small, because it's undecorated, you know, everything is writable in there. And then on the inside of the back cover, this is just the other part of the airmail envelope. So I thought that was really nice to pop on there. And you could write things like, you know, this journal belongs to or something. And I thought this looked really cool to just kind of make a little banner or, you know, decorative portion there down the edge with all of these vintage postage stamps. So I just thought that finished that little journal off really nicely. So yeah, that's kind of everything really. So if I just pop that into that pocket, yeah, really different for me. I really enjoyed working with these two items, but I did want to kind of set myself a challenge for, you know, not putting bling everywhere, not having flowers everywhere. Well, I did have flowers everywhere, I guess, on this, but yeah, so it was quite a challenge for me, but I did really enjoy them, and you know, I hope that you guys really like them and how they turned out. So as I say, they're both obviously for sale, available in my Etsy, and yeah, they're all kind of predominantly made from vintage supplies. So yeah, hope that you like them, and thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you all again soon. Thanks then, bye.